joining you from the Virginia Tech History Department, where I'm an associate professor, and I'm also director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. And it's the Civil War Center that's sponsoring tonight's event. And those of you who have come to our events before will know well, we do a range of different kinds of activities, all with the general theme of really trying to share as much high quality Civil War era history as we can with as many different audiences as we possibly can. And so we do a lot of work with students. We give out scholarships and fellowships, research grants, postdoctoral fellowships. We do a lot of work with teachers and students in the community at the K through 12 level. For example, we have an outreach program to fourth grade elementary school classrooms. We also do a lot of work with academic Civil War historians, conferences, and that kind of thing. But probably the single biggest kind of audience we serve is the general public interested in all aspects of Civil War era history. And tonight's talk is a really good example of that side of our work. It's one of a series of webinars. We've been doing them roughly once every month or so for the last 2 years, and we are going to continue. I think no matter what happens with the pandemic, we're going to continue using the Zoom platform to reach many people around the country and even around the world in some cases. Our next webinar is coming up next month, April 26th, and that one's with Dr. Angela Elder. She is publishing a new book on Confederate widows. In fact, I think April 26th is the official publication date. So we're very excited to see her new book and hear from her. And if you're interested in signing up for that event, you can go to our website, which is civilwar.bt.edu. Should be able to see it right next to me here on the banner. And of course, you can also find us by searching for Virginia Center for Civil War Studies on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube as well. So tonight's event is a very exciting one. Our speaker is Dr. Lorian Foote, who is the Patricia and Bookman Peters Professor of History at Texas A&M University. And she's the author of 4 books and the editor of 2 additional books. And these are on a variety of Civil War topics, including things like manhood and violence in the Union Army and US POWs who escaped from imprisonment in the Confederacy. And that project gave rise not only to a book, but also a really interesting digital humanities project called Fugitive Federals, which, among other things, will allow users to track the escape routes federal prisoners of war took as they escaped these camps in the Confederate States during the war. Her most recent book, which of course is the subject of tonight's event and my prop for this evening, is Rites of Retaliation, Civilization, Soldiers and Campaigns in the American Civil War. And this came out just a few months ago from UNC Press. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I know we're going to enjoy listening to Dr. Foote talk about it tonight. And of course, it's available at all booksellers under the sun, wherever you buy your books from. No doubt you can obtain a copy of Rites of Retaliation. So tonight's agenda is Dr. Foote will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. We're not super strict, but that's the general target. And we'll have time for discussion at the end. So we always invite audience questions, audience comments. And so far, at least, the audience has never failed to provide us with excellent questions and comments. And I'm sure tonight will be no exception. And the way you can do that is by typing directly into the Q&A box in Zoom. So the chat function will not work. You won't be able to turn off or turn on your microphone or your camera. Everything we'll do through the Q&A box. And then Dr. Foote and I will keep an eye on the Q&A box. We'll get to as many questions as we can. And we'll wrap up at the latest by about 8:15 Eastern time. So just a little over an hour from now. So that's all from me for now. I'm really grateful to Dr. Foote for joining us this evening. Really looking forward to the talk. So I think we should give her a virtual round of applause and welcome her to our screens. Thanks so much for being with us.
Dr. Quigley, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just delighted to be here and to share the research with you. I found it fascinating, and so I hope that the audience will find it fascinating as well. So I want to begin by telling you about something that happened On February 23rd, 1865, the Confederate leadership committed an act that violated the principles upon which they had promised to fight their war for independence. On that day, Confederate agents in Virginia delivered to the United States 14 Black Union soldiers for exchange as prisoners of war. And then 4 days later, when US naval commanders in the Gulf of Mexico proposed that free Black sailors and soldiers fighting in the Confederacy's Trans-Mississippi Department be treated as prisoners of war, Confederate military officials agreed. And these two moments happened because US authorities had conducted a retaliation ritual in the Department of the South to protect Northern-born free Black US soldiers. And this ritual changed Confederate policy. Today, many writers and historians conflate retaliation with revenge. But during the American Civil War, retaliation was a ritual with a purpose. And that purpose was to negotiate civilized war and manage how campaigns were conducted. So what I'd like to speak with you tonight about is this ritual of retaliation and how it worked to change people's behavior during campaigns. So I'm going to share my screen with you here to help you follow along. So let me get that shared and then I'll continue. So that's the kind of starting point that I want to be sure that we all understand, that retaliation is a ritual with a purpose to negotiate civilized war and manage how campaigns are conducted. So retaliation is consistent with the code. Oh, hold on a moment. With the code that governed the conduct of US armies in the field, which is General Orders number 100, which this was issued on April 24th, 1863. Article 27 of General Orders number 100 proclaimed that civilized nations acknowledge retaliation as the sternest feature of war. A reckless enemy often leaves to his opponent no other means of securing himself against the repetition of barbarous outrage. The next article continued that retaliation is not revenge, but rather a means of, quote, protective retribution. Retaliation was only legitimate if it was done cautiously and unavoidably, and only after careful inquiry into the real occurrence. The author of the code, Francis Lieber, who was an expert on the international laws of war, cautioned that unjust or inconsiderate retaliation removes the belligerents farther and farther from the mitigating rules of regular war, and by rapid steps leads them nearer to the war of savages. So I think these lines in this are interesting, the reference to civilized and customs of war and the war of savages, because this is going to get us to one of the themes of my project, which is actually civilization and what it meant to Americans who were fighting the Civil War. Because retaliation against prisoners of war is actually a common feature of the American Civil War. Field commanders use retaliation during nearly every military campaign, and civilian leaders frequently turned to the practice when they confronted contentious policy issues. Union and Confederate officials shared a ritual of retaliation that played an important role in determining how each side fought the war. Equally important, retaliation reflected the cultural worldview of civilization. Americans talked constantly about civilized war. Anyone who's done even only a little research into primary sources in the Civil War will acknowledge that the word civilization or the word savage is used constantly in correspondence, diaries, official correspondence. Americans litter their correspondence with reference to the rules of civilized war, and they incessantly accuse the other side of savagery in private and public formats. This is because Americans in the Civil War era considered themselves to be part of a transatlantic set of civilized nations that they believed represented the pinnacle of social evolution to that point in history. So there are three essential elements to civilized war as the majority of Americans understood it at this time. The first is restraint. Self-control, order, and deliberation underlies the violence of a civilized war, which was most easily defined through contrast with its opposite. Animal-like anger, uncontrolled passion, and unlimited and indiscriminate violence marks a savage conflict. Civilized nations fought with uniformed combatants who represented the state and were under the discipline and control of gentlemen officers. Gentlemen officers ensured that the effects of violence on non-combatants were minimized. The second indispensable aspect of civilized war was that combatants participated in the accumulated wisdom of civilized people stretching back to ancient times. Americans perceived themselves as part of a shared history and took care to contextualize every action taken in warfare as a consistent outgrowth of that history. They mined history for examples from warfare to justify their policies or to accuse their enemies, and consistently and constantly cited precedents for the actions that they took. Official and private correspondence during the Civil War was filled with historical references. Finally, civilized war was honorable, not in the modern sense of just or virtuous, but in its classical definition. Nations had a reputation to uphold before a peer audience. You could not claim yourself to be a worthy nation unless other civilized nations acknowledged your claim. The Union and the Confederacy had to convince other civilized nations who observed and judged them about the righteousness of their conduct. Civilized war is a performance where mastery of rhetoric, protocols, and etiquette were vitally important to establishing a nation's claim to civilized status. So the purpose of retaliation is to enforce the customs of war among civilized nations. Military leaders on both sides in the Civil War agreed on the basic rules and the established rituals of retaliation. Retaliation is different from revenge by both purpose and procedure. Its intent is to prevent the enemy from continuing specific barbaric acts and to enforce the civilized usages of war. So Major General Henry Halleck, who served as General-in-Chief for Union armies for nearly 2 years and was an acknowledged authority on the subject, wrote that the object of retaliation is deterrence and prevention. As Lincoln instructed one of his generals, and here I'm quoting Lincoln, "I wish you to do nothing merely for revenge, but what you may do shall be done solely with reference to the security of the future." Confederate Secretary of War James A. Seddon believed the point of retaliation was to produce a thorough reformation of the offending nation. The head of the Confederate Bureau of War thought a little real shooting of prisoners would do good, prevent suffering, and save life. So a combatant who was considering retaliation wrote a letter to his component that contains several elements placed in sequence. First was a statement of the desire to fight the war on civilized principles. This was always the first thing that the writer did in his letter. Then the writer named a specific barbarous act that the enemy had committed that supposedly violated the international customs of war. Then the letter writer offered an opportunity for the recipient of the letter to disavow this barbarous incident by proffering 3 suggested acceptable explanations. The first was that perhaps the writer of the letter was misinformed and the incident had not actually happened. A second acceptable explanation was that the incident did happen, but that the guilty parties who committed the atrocity had acted without the sanction, the official sanction of the military that they were in. So everybody acknowledges that periodically a soldier will commit an atrocious act that wasn't sanctioned by his authorities. Or a third possible explanation is that, yeah, the incident happened, but it wasn't sanctioned and the perpetrators will be punished by the side whose soldiers or officials or whoever committed the atrocious act. So the addressee, the person who receives the letter, could submit evidence that the perpetrators would be punished. So then the writer of the letter concludes with a time limit to receive a response. And if he hasn't received an acceptable response within that time limit, then the writer of the letter names a specific measure of retaliation that will be implemented against a named individual or group of people. And that retaliation is supposed to be proportional to the offense that was committed. So these negotiations framed every military campaign actually that occurs in the Civil War, but specifically in the Department of the South, which I chose as the subject for my book, because I thought it was important to zero in on one military theater, because retaliation is best understood if you follow retaliation incidents from beginning to end and follow the characters in each theater, because only then can you really understand the nuances of how retaliation operated. So my book includes a military history of the Department of the South that covers its officers, its soldiers, and its campaigns, raids, battles, bombardments. But for our purpose here, I want to use 3 examples, 3 points of contention between the Union and the Confederacy in the Department of the South and the retaliation incidents that kind of exemplify how this worked. So the first issue of contention in the Department of the South was the Union's deployment of Black soldiers. Here, the Union successfully used retaliation to change Confederate policy towards Black US soldiers who had been born free in northern states. So it begins in 1861 and 1862 when an abolitionist Union General, David Hunter, created regiments of Black soldiers from South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, deployed them in raids along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia to destroy plantations and liberate enslaved people. And so here's a map that kind of shows the South Carolina Sea Islands, which the Union military took control of in 1861. So this is the source that Hunter saw for recruits. And these are going to be the rivers that he is going to use for raids. By 1863, as many of us have heard of, there's raids like the June 2nd, 1863 Combahee River raid by portions of the 2nd South Carolina. And so you can see here the burning of the rice fields, the liberating of enslaved people. The Confederate government, after a very interesting internal negotiation, which I fully cover in the book, issued a retaliation resolution that required Black soldiers, even if they were born free in northern states, to be turned over to states for trial as servile insurrectionists. So many historians are familiar with this resolution in May of 1863 by the Confederate Congress, which said that Confederate military courts could try US commissioned officers in command of Black troops for inciting servile insurrection and put them to death or otherwise punish them, and that Blacks taken in arms, and the language in the resolution is very specific, even if born free in a northern state, would be delivered to state authorities in the state where they were captured. So it took until the summer of 1863 for Confederates to take any Black prisoners in the Department of the South after this retaliation resolution was issued. But it happened in the summer of 1863 when captured Black soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts who had been captured here on Sologaire Island, and then also in an attack on Fort Wagner here in Charleston Harbor during the Union military efforts to capture Charleston. So at the same time that these Black soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts, most of whom were born free in northern states, were captured, the US War Department received a letter smuggled to Nassau by 3 Black sailors of the Union Navy asking for protection by the US government. Orrin H. Brown, William H. Johnson, and William Wilson were 3 Black sailors who had been born in the state of New York. Their ship had been captured, but all the white sailors had been exchanged. They were put in the Charleston jail. They managed to smuggle this letter, which found its way eventually to the US Navy Department. And with this letter, which gave specific evidence of what Confederates were doing with northern-born Black US military personnel, the Union War Department was able to act. They also had the backing of the Union War Department of the incredible publicity in the North and in Europe about the fate of the prisoners of the 54th Massachusetts, because the regiment's organizers were rich and powerful New England Republicans with international literary ties. So because of this situation, the United States issued General Order 252 on July 31st, 1863. It stated that to sell or enslave any captured person on account of his color and for no offense against the laws of war is a relapse into barbarism and a crime against the civilization of the age. So the retaliation proclaimed in this order was that a Confederate POW would be put to hard labor for every US soldier sold into slavery, and that the United States would execute a Confederate POW for every US soldier put to death. So historians are well aware of General Order 252, but what they've completely missed, because they haven't gone into the weeds of retaliation incidents across time in specific departments, is that this order was issued to specifically address the situation in the Department of the South and to explicitly address the capture of northern-born free Black soldiers. And in the retaliation correspondence that goes along with this general order, the Confederate War Department received the message. In their own internal correspondence, it's clear that they understand that this order was issued to protect free Black soldiers, particularly because what other historians have missed is that the US government sets aside 3 white South Carolina soldiers, prisoners of war, as hostages to secure the enforcement of this order. And the Confederate War Department again understood that these 3 white South Carolina soldiers were hostages for the men of the 54th Massachusetts, but more specifically, the 3 Black sailors from New York. So this created a crisis in the Confederate War Department because some within it argued that the US did have the right to arm its own citizens, as free Black men clearly were. So for example, Robert Garlick Hill Keene, who was the director of the Confederate Bureau of War, he wrote his superiors, "It is very clear the United States have the right to enlist any of their own citizens. They have long in those states regarded Negroes as citizens, as in Massachusetts, allowing them the right of suffrage." International attention also swayed Secretary of War Seddon and President Jefferson Davis. They realized the incredible international publicity attending this particular retaliation issue, and that the civilized world was watching what they were going to do. And so eventually, they ordered Southern governors to ignore the retaliation resolutions and to put freeborn Black US soldiers who were captured at the Battle of Olustee in Florida, which happened in February of 1864, in Andersonville with white prisoners of war. So after Black soldiers were captured, after a massacre that occurred that I can talk about in the Q&A, those who were captured were treated as prisoners of war and put in Andersonville with white POWs. The soldiers of the 54th who were captured in Charleston were eventually integrated into the Confederate military prison system, and those 3 Black sailors from New York were exchanged. And additionally, the Confederacy actually puts in writing their change of policy. So Seddon gave instructions to governors that the congressional resolutions were defunct because of the embarrassments attending the problem of free Black prisoners. He talked about the serious consequences which might ensue from rigid enforcement of the act. Here he's talking about the execution of those 3 white South Carolina hostages. And he orders governors and Confederate military officers to treat free Black men as POWs, except in some trivial particulars indicative of inferior consideration. And then the Confederacy finally in February actually puts amendments to their retaliation resolution to make a distinction between formerly enslaved Black soldiers and Black soldiers born free in the North. The language changes from employing Negro slaves. It changes to employ Negro slaves instead of employing Negroes in war against the Confederate States. It repealed the sections that required military courts to execute or punish white officers, and it repealed the section that required Confederate officers to deliver Black prisoners to state authorities. So in this long retaliation incident that occurred, eventually the Confederacy changes its policy and puts it in writing. The second big issue apparent in the Department of the South was Confederate treatment of Union POWs. My research uncovered a retaliation incident that academic historians have been completely unaware of. In 1864, the commander of the Department of the South was John G. Foster. And when Confederates brought Union prisoners from Georgia to Charleston during the federal bombardment of the city and put them in locations under fire from Union guns, he received permission to bring Confederate POWs to the islands in the Charleston harbor to put them under fire from Confederate guns. So this aspect historians know about, that both the Union and the Confederacy brought prisoners of war to Charleston harbor and put them under fire. But here's the part that wasn't known until you follow the retaliation through to its conclusion. So during this time, the condition of the Union prisoners held at Andersonville and in Macon in Georgia became known to Foster, because escaped prisoners crossed into Union lines and reported what was going on, particularly the low quantity and quality of the rations. So when Confederates ultimately removed the Union prisoners from Charleston, Foster sent the Confederate POWs that he still held, he sent them to Fort Pulaski in Georgia and to Hilton Head. And I've got a picture here of the building where he put them. And he ordered that these 600 Confederate prisoners of war receive the exact same rations that Union prisoners had received at Andersonville. Under this regimen, the Confederate officers sickened, and federal medical inspectors wrote that their health could not be sustained under that diet. Now, interestingly, Foster's retaliation was actually not legal and not an example of how the retaliation ritual was supposed to work, because he did not notify his opponent about what he was doing. And if you don't notify your opponent, they can't change their behavior. So because of that, when he was relieved of command, his subordinates, who always disagreed with this retaliation, and some of whom even tried to mitigate the condition of the prisoners, they were able to convince the new commander to stop this retaliation. The third issue was federal treatment of non-combatants. This was highlighted during Sherman's march to the sea and through South Carolina. During this campaign, William Tecumseh Sherman, marching his army through Georgia and then up through South Carolina, Union officers in his staff and in his command. So I've got a picture here of Sherman's staff officers in May 1865. They were very concerned about civilization and how to maintain self-control and discipline of soldiers while unleashing them to destroy resources and wage psychological warfare on the Confederate population. So what's really interesting, right before Sherman's march, his staff is joined by Henry Hitchcock, who was new to the war. He'd been a lawyer in St. Louis. He was related to Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who is the U.S. Commissioner for Exchange of Prisoners. And he decides in the fall of 1864, he wants to join the Union Army. And his uncle sets up for him to be on Sherman's staff. And Hitchcock brings to the war a typical concern about civilization. And he becomes obsessed about whether this army that he has joined is behaving in a civilized fashion. So he conducts a personal investigation that he records in his diary. And every night he sits down with other officers and asks them questions. Did your men pillage? Did they act civilized today? How barbaric were they? Did you do anything to stop them if they were behaving in a barbarous fashion? And he records the answers of officers in his diary. His obsession and that of other like-minded officers was pillaging, because the international laws of war allow for foraging by an army. But pillaging is the hallmark of a savage army. It is a sign of out of control soldiers who are looting and destroying for no reason but violence and bloodlust. So there's a faction of Sherman's army of officers in Sherman's army that become increasingly convinced over the course of the campaign that a portion of their army is out of control. And then there's a faction of officers who claim that it's not, and only a few men commit acts like pillaging, and that no army can control everyone. So this reaches kind of a summit point when Sherman's army arrives in South Carolina, and kind of the behavior and the misbehavior of soldiers escalate. So what happens is, starting in Georgia but escalating in South Carolina, Confederate soldiers and citizens began murdering Union stragglers or foragers after they had surrendered. And this is going to launch another retaliation incident. Union General Judson Kilpatrick, who's the head of Sherman's cavalry, wrote his counterpart, General Joseph Wheeler, about the murder of 18 Union soldiers whose throats had been cut. And Kilpatrick follows the protocol, the ritual of retaliation. He follows it exactly. He specifically describes the incident, the atrocity. He asked for an explanation. And then he said if no explanation is forthcoming, that he would shoot 18 Confederate prisoners. Wheeler responded, as you should respond in this ritual. He said he was shocked and outraged to hear about this. He promised to investigate. He promised to do justice. And he said if the report was correct, that he agreed that retaliation should happen, but he preferred that it would be inflicted on the guilty parties and not on innocent prisoners of war. So Kilpatrick was satisfied, and he said that he trusted Wheeler to investigate and find the guilty parties. And then Kilpatrick makes an extraordinary statement in his correspondence that reflects this obsession with pillaging and civilized war that we see in both armies during the American Civil War. Here's what he said. He writes to Wheeler If stragglers from my command are found in the houses of any citizens committing any outrages, whatever, my own people are directed to shoot them on the spot. And of course, I expect officers and soldiers of your command to do the same. So here Kilpatrick is encouraging Confederate officers to shoot Union soldiers if they are caught entering houses or committing other outrages. So this should have ended matters. But when Kilpatrick reported to Sherman that the 18 Union soldiers had papers on their bodies that said death to all foragers, Sherman ordered the immediate execution of 18 prisoners of war. And here was why. The sign on their dead bodies that said death to all foragers indicated that the Union soldiers were mutilated and killed, that their throats were cut because they were foragers, not pillagers. And Sherman knew that it was a war right under the international law of war for invading armies to forage the countryside. So he then orders his commanders to take life for life if any foragers were murdered, and to leave labels on their body indicating the intention to kill man for man. Sherman did this because he thought the people of the Confederacy would police themselves if they truly believed a terrible punishment on their soldiers or their community would follow. So after Sherman issues this order, the next day, Federal scouts found the bodies of 21 Union infantrymen naked with their throats cut. So Sherman wrote Lieutenant General Wade Hampton, who commanded all Confederate cavalry in South Carolina, and whose home had been burned and pillaged by Union soldiers just a few days before. Sherman wrote to Hampton that foraging was a war right and that he would protect his foragers with retaliation of life for life. But he also wrote he would not protect his pillagers. He told Hampton in this letter that if the people resisted his foragers, he would not deem it wrong. And then Sherman backed this up with circular orders that he issued to divisions and brigades in his army. This was on February 25th, 1865. And here is what he said in the circular. He ordered officers in his army to retaliate life for life if any foragers were killed after capture, and to keep a record. He also ordered that foragers should be kept within reasonable bounds for the sake of discipline. And then he said, I will not protect them when they enter dwellings and commit wanton waste, such as women's apparel, jewelry, and such things as are not needed by our army. And he also instructed his commanders that if citizens of South Carolina resisted foragers, I will not deem that wrong. So here again, we see how retaliation is a way for commanders to put on record what they will accept, what they won't accept, to show how they're following the civilized rules of war, and to actually change kind of orders and attempt to curb the behavior of soldiers if that becomes necessary through this ritual. So Hampton wrote back that he would execute 2 prisoners for every 1 Confederate prisoner who was executed. He characterized Union foragers as thieves who robbed citizens and fired their houses, and he said that he ordered his men to shoot down all Union soldiers who were caught burning houses. He told Sherman that his army was composed of wild beasts rather than men. And it's interesting because in retaliation correspondence, there's a constant use of animal metaphors because civilization draws a sharp distinction between the human and the animal. So the worst thing that you can do is to accuse someone of being animal-like or animalistic. Hampton set aside 56 prisoners of war as hostages in case Sherman continued his execution policy. But Sherman did execute, and he executed 43 prisoners of war in South Carolina, more than any other commander during a single campaign. In this case, retaliation reflected an escalating cycle of violence rather than keeping the violence in check. So I use this retaliation incident to talk about how retaliation can misfunction and misfire. Instead of checking violence, it can actually be something that contributes to an escalating cycle of violence. And in this case, it's a perfect storm of the personality of the commanders, mistakes that Sherman makes during this ritual, but also a pattern of revenge and violence that had occurred throughout this campaign. So Americans on both sides, in conclusion, are deeply concerned about this escalating violence in the Department of the South, for it seemed to undermine the important case that their war was civilized. So my book is really about the worldview of civilization, what Americans meant by this and what it meant for their identity. And it also shows what happens, as we see here in Sherman's campaign, when Americans begin to fear that they're not as civilized as they thought. They proclaim at the beginning of the war that they have a place in civilization and they're going to fight a war with restraint and honor. And then they look at where things are and they don't see that restraint. They fear that they have committed acts that shame them before the world of public opinion. So studying the rights of retaliation allows us to understand the war as Americans experienced it, not just as a crisis of nationhood or a crisis of republicanism, but they experienced it as a crisis of their civilization. So if you're interested in learning more about the crisis of civilization, as Dr. Quigley mentioned, you can buy my book, Rights of Retaliation, on Amazon, many other booksellers, and then the UNC Press website, which is currently having an online sale that will give you 40% off if you order using the discount code that I have here on the slide. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. If you want to jot down the discount code, you can do that quickly now, or go back and look at this later on YouTube. But I want to get back to full screen so you can see me better. And let me stop sharing. And I'm ready to take questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really fascinating. And I encourage everyone to type your questions into the Q&A box. We have a question about the practice of trying to persuade or coerce prisoners of war into joining your armed services. Galvanization is sometimes called.
Yes.
Did that play into the retaliation culture at all? Did it have any impact on retaliation?
Oh, that's an interesting question that no one has asked me before. I don't see that it did. I didn't come across, I mean, of course, I came across discussion of galvanized soldiers, both by soldiers in the Department of the South. I mean, and there were soldiers who galvanized in the Department of the South, of course, but I didn't see that actually impact the retaliation ritual or discussions of civilization in any way.
Thank you. We have another question about the ongoing Indian Wars and the ways in which those conflicts contributed to retaliation culture, ideas about retaliation culture, and of course those comparisons of civilization versus savagery that are so central in your book.
Right. Now that's a great question. So one of the things that occurs is that civilized combatants make a distinction between when they're fighting other civilized combatants and when they're fighting people that they view as savages. So people that are viewed as savages, because they don't have restraint, because they don't have honor, you can't use retaliation to reform them. So the view is you have to fight savages like savages because you can't apply the rules that you could apply if you were fighting a civilized opponent. So you're not going to see the same kind of customs and rituals and etiquette in the Indian Wars because those opponents are viewed as savages. And so, and it's interesting too, a lot of times in the retaliation correspondence, that plays out in how Union commanders are going to treat white guerrillas within the Confederacy, because guerrilla warfare is seen inherently as savage warfare. General Orders Number 100 does not recognize guerrillas as legitimate combatants. They can be summarily executed. They can be treated as pirates, banditti, highway robbers, savages. And so we see a very different dynamic how the Union is going to respond to guerrilla warfare and indigenous peoples warfare, because those are viewed as not legitimate combatants who are behaving in a savage way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the questions I'm sure you get asked a lot is how did all of this apply to warfare in other theaters and campaigns, including guerrilla warfare in other parts of the Civil War?
Well, and that, and it's very interesting because the guerrilla warfare, the retaliation regarding that has a very different dynamic. So in an essay that I have in a book called Crossing the Deadline that's edited by Mike Gray, I have an essay about retaliation where I go into a lot of detail about guerrilla warfare because there's a lot of retaliation along the Mississippi River because Grant and Sherman in 1862 and 1863 are really concerned by guerrillas who are firing from the banks of the Mississippi River onto unarmed Union transports. So this launches a whole retaliation incident with Pemberton, the Confederate general at Vicksburg. And these incidents are always very different because the problem is the Confederate military leadership, while they would use retaliation to defend partisans, they actually are also uncomfortable with unaffiliated guerrillas. In other words, the Confederate leadership concedes that unaffiliated guerrillas are not a civilized component of war, that people who aren't in uniform, that are not responsible to a commander who's part of the state because their violence isn't regulated, it's out of control. So the Confederacy kind of fails in all of their retaliation incidents in the Trans-Mississippi because the Confederate leadership just basically concedes the Union position on guerrillas and won't do anything about Union summary executions of guerrillas in Missouri, Kentucky, and along the Mississippi River.
So we often get comments on social media about the events that we're hosting, and this reminds me one of the pithy comments I saw about this event was something like civilized warfare. There's no such thing, and it is kind of a problem, isn't it, when you're thinking about what these guys are doing to each other, even in quote unquote regular warfare, to think about the difficulties of claiming that that is civilized, versus other forms of violence, which are not.
Right. But I think that's one reason that my book is important because we can, as modern people, make these pithy comments, there's no such thing. But they believed there was such a thing, and they really believed it. And so if we're going to understand how they could do the things they did, but still also claim there's such a thing as civilized war, and we need to understand the worldview of civilization and how that worldview accounted for atrocities and what they tried to do about atrocities, because the whole point is that's what retaliation existed. Americans were appalled by some of the atrocities that occurred, that their own side committed. But that was the point. There was within their customs of war something that you were supposed to be able to do about it, to try to rein that back in, to try to stop those atrocities from escalating. And so that's what they were trying to do with these rituals that they implemented. Now, whether they worked or not, we also have to understand when they worked and how they broke down. But we've got to understand their worldview. And we may not think that war could be civilized, but they did.
Yeah, that was really well put. Thank you. So one viewer is asking about the destruction of private property when it was for war aims. So we're not talking about retaliation or revenge. We're talking about destruction of property that can help one side or the other achieve their war aims. How does that fit into the retaliation debate?
No, that's a great question. That's part of what the ritual is also designed to help. So of course, the customs of war and the international laws of war are not this list of clear-cut rules. They're put down in big, complex books by European philosophers and legal experts that eventually the United States is going to try to kind of distill in General Orders 100. But the point is, within the customs of war, there are aspects of war such as destroying private property. When is that legitimate? When does it cross the line? Who can do it? Can you forage in particular ways and not in other ways? These are some things that there is some debate about. And there's examples I talked at the beginning of the presentation that you mine history, for example. So like, what have civilized nations done in their warfare? That's part of kind of what guides you. But you can provide examples from Roman warfare, from French warfare, from British warfare that can kind of justify different practices. So one of the things, so for example, in the Union bombardment of Charleston, there's a retaliation ritual I talk about in the book that I didn't talk about in this presentation that gets into the heart of can there be destruction of private property through bombardment, and where does how far away do you have to be able to bombard a city? Do you have to have the city under siege for it to be legitimate for you to bombard the city? Do you have to give notice in advance? These are kind of questions that it wasn't clear what the answers were. And that's where the ritual is supposed to allow both sides to debate. And so in a lot of the letters that I read during the retaliation ritual, I mean, the commanders who are writing these letters, they will be 10 pages long and they will be filled with references to past conflicts and quoting from learned books, trying to prove you committed an atrocity. Here are all of the historical examples that show that this is an atrocity, that it's not acceptable. And then the other side will write back and say, but wait a minute, there's counter examples. The British did this, the French did this, the Romans did this. And so what we did doesn't violate the laws of war. You can destroy private property in these circumstances. And so it allows them to sort through areas where it's a little cloudy.
Yeah. The letters are really interesting to me, and listening to your presentation in particular, I was sort of reminded of dueling correspondence.
Yes.
In the precision, the
Yes.
exhaustiveness with which they're exploring the issues, accusing each other, but often kind of leaving the opportunity to back out or say,
Yes.
it didn't really happen that way, or we can explain it. Are there parallels there? And, did people bring lessons from dueling correspondence to this retaliation culture?
Yes, because I think that gets back to their belief that in civilized war, the officers are gentlemen. So they would come to this with one of the essential hallmarks of a gentleman is honor, that you understand that reputation matters. And so what they understood from the dueling ritual is something that they understand then how to put that into their retaliation rituals as well. And I mean, I think it's interesting because one of the things that I saw frequently in internal correspondence, so this wouldn't be when they're writing their enemy, but when officers or when civilian administrators are kind of discussing whether to start a retaliation ritual or how they're going to respond to one, they always say something like, how will this look to the eyes of history? They use that phrase a lot because they really believe, they know everybody's going to read their correspondence. They know that someday a Lorian Foote is going to sit down and read their correspondence. And they really care, how are they going to be judged? Their honor even extends to how people in the future are going to look back on them. So if we do this, will history condemn us? That matters to them. And that's part of honor.
Yeah, and I think that goes into one of the other themes I really like about the book is the sense that in that moment, they're playing to the court of international opinion around them. So not only in the future, but in the present tense, they're worried about what other people, especially quote unquote civilized nations, think about what they're doing.
And I think that's why they back down on the issue of free Black soldiers. So the Confederacy is convinced that the international laws of war support them on their position of people who are formerly enslaved. They believe that they can point to all of these examples. They'll say even Napoleon did not free Russian serfs, right? Because you never start a servile insurrection when you're combating an enemy. So they think they're on solid ground, but they recognize that actually the idea of employing your own citizens, even if those citizens would be considered enslaved people for one of the combatants, that they're on. And so their correspondence, they frequently talk about, this is embarrassing, this is dangerous. They use that word, that it's very clear that the Union's international publicity campaign around the 54th Massachusetts, the Confederates believe that they're being shamed in the International Court of Public Opinion. And that's one reason they're going to shift gears on that one.
Yeah. Thank you. One viewer is asking whether there was a prisoner exchange system in the Department of the South, like there was in other theaters, and how did the early use of Black troops in this region influence that?
Right, so that's a great question. So I didn't go into detail in this talk at all. In the book, I spend a lot of time talking about what happens in 1861 and 1862, because not only is Hunter trying to raise a Black regiment, but Black men on the Sea Islands on their own are arming themselves and trying to protect their local communities from Confederate raiders who are crossing onto the islands and trying to kidnap people or re-enslave them. And so there's an incident where Confederates capture 6 Black men who are in federal uniform, but this is really before any soldiers have been mustered into the Union Army. The Confederacy will execute these soldiers. So David Hunter, he starts on his own, stopping exchanging prisoners because he wants to protect not only Black soldiers, but Black men who are trying to protect themselves. So he tells his Confederate counterpart that he's doing this. So there's kind of a breakdown of exchange in the Department of the South, even before there's a breakdown of exchange in the wider military conflict, because Hunter really does want to protect his soldiers. So he even has, when the first South Carolina starts escalating its raids in November of 1862, Hunter instructs them to capture prominent white citizens so that he can hold them as hostages in Hilton Head for the safety of his Black soldiers. And so he collects hostages from the beginning of the war to try to protect. So then something on kind of a different way of answering that question, when Foster and Sam Jones, who's the Confederate commander of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in 1864, they try to conduct a whole bunch of prisoner exchanges, even when their superiors tell them not to. So one of the things I talk about in the book, Foster is so traumatized by, he's the commander on the ground for hearing the first reports about Andersonville and what's happening at Macon. And so in addition to trying retaliation, he also just desperately wants there to be a prisoner exchange. So he keeps trying to arrange an exchange of prisoners with his counterpart. And both of them get so out of control and do so many special exchanges that both the Union War Department and the Confederate War Department rebuke them and say, you stop now. And so, yeah, there's a lot of local exchanges that actually have to be reined in the Department of the South at one point.
Great. We have it sounds like more of a philosophical question.
Okay.
Most of the others, which goes like this. You just sketched out the rationalist argument about proportionality. What was the discourse, if any, about the applicability of the Mosaic argument that limits retributive justice to an eye for an eye?
Okay, so that is a great question. Let me answer that in one way to answer your specific question, and then also to bring in a point you didn't ask in the question. So there's a lot of discussion among the philosophers, not so much just your ordinary officers who still use the ritual and still kind of seem to understand it. But there's a lot of discussion, for example, between Halleck and Lieber, as they try to write General Orders number 100, as Halleck kind of oversees a lot of the retaliation, how you apply principles from the Bible and principles from the international customs of war. So tit for tat actually is the phrase, eye for an eye, tit for tat, is the phrase that Lieber and Halleck use in their personal correspondence to enunciate the principle that you can never go above tit for tat. It has to be limited to that. And part of that is, of course, you're trying to limit the violence, but part of it is they believe that's kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition, drawing from, that tradition. So, but on that note, I've got to throw in, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, a lot of Christians who are active in Bible studies in the department, or who are particularly identify as Christian, they are vocal opponents of retaliation because they argue that Christianity should trump civilization and that Christians do not retaliate in any way, that it doesn't matter if your enemy is committing atrocious acts. You cannot respond to that by killing innocent prisoners of war. You're supposed to love your enemy, and retaliation undermines that. So there are important voices both nationally and in the Department of the South that argues that retaliation is anti-Christian. And so that's kind of an interesting sub part of that. So I'll throw this in as an example. When the union leadership in Washington, D.C. is considering whether to do a national ration retaliation against Confederate prisoners of war, Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who's the commissioner for exchange of prisoners, he's worried about how this will look in the eyes of history. So he writes letters to prominent reformers and transcendentalists in New England and says, okay, we're thinking about cutting the ration for prisoners of war in our hands. Should we do that or not? What do you think? And he writes Sophia Peabody Mann. He writes, no, that's Mary Mann, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, I'm sorry, and Mary Mann and some other women in New England, and ask them what they think. And it's really interesting because one of them writes back, she says, there can't be retaliation because of Christian principles. We just have to do the right thing regardless of what the other side is doing, and to purposely sicken or starve anyone, even if that's allowed by the rules of retaliation, would be wrong. So they're really exploring this before they do anything. And then again, if retaliation is done properly, you're supposed to investigate, you're supposed to do it deliberately. You're not supposed to do it in a spirit of passion or revenge. So at the times when it's operating properly, they're actually trying to gauge opinion from who they think are important constituencies that would tell them how people are going to react to it.
Yeah, fascinating. I thought that question might stump you, but you've obviously given it a lot of thought, and it obviously has a lot of kind of traction in the 1860s as well, with people really giving a lot of active thought to that. So I have another kind of question, different from the others, which is about the process of writing the book. And what readers and listeners might not know immediately is that the book took shape in the context of a distinguished lecture series at Penn State University. And I was wondering how, if at all, that affected the way you wrote the book, the way you approached the topic, and the final product. Would it have been different if you had just done the usual thing and come up with a topic for a book and gone out and written it?
Yeah, I think it would have, and here's why. Because the Broz Lectures, I was so honored and privileged to be able to present the Broz Lectures at Penn State University, and the purpose of that is you have 3 nights, you get to do 3 lectures, and then you have this audience of other faculty and grad students and the general public. But by doing 3 lectures, I was able to present my ideas very much in depth. And then I got all of these questions. And then at the end, the director of the Richard Civil War Era Center, who in this case is Rachel Sheldon, she sends me like a 6-page report, about what people were saying after my lectures, and then her own thoughts about it. And so what was in that report was the fascination with the civilization aspect. And so that really got me thinking about how to bring that out in kind of a different way, I think, than I had planned originally, when I really wanted to focus on the effect on the campaigns and how retaliation worked in the military history aspect. And that really got me thinking about the worldview that kind of was the overarching element under which all the rest of this was operating. So yeah, those lectures really shaped the civilization aspect of the book.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I do think that was very profitable then, because I think that huge significance where, you make the argument that the Civil War wasn't just, a crisis of nationhood or republicanism. It was also about different definitions of, or trying to define civilization and what civilized warfare might look like. I think that's a really important argument to make.
Well, and I think it was kind of one of those the Rose lectures kind of in conjunction with, I'd already kind of started the research for my next project, which it entails actually reading a lot of animal studies literature. And so I was starting to read the animal studies literature as I was getting ready to write Rights of Retaliation. And that was really helpful because the animal studies literature does a lot with how people in the 19th century viewed humans and animals and their constant use of civilization and savagery and animal-like behavior. So reading the animal studies literature gave me a whole new way of understanding when they say things like your men are wild beasts, or when every prisoner of war talks about they're treating us like hogs, they're putting us in a pen like sheep, we're being treated like hogs. I mean, before those metaphors, I understood what they were saying, but the true depth and significance of it had gone over my head because I didn't really understand how 19th century people viewed the difference between humans and animals. And understanding that really helped me understand the civilization worldview.
Yeah. So earlier we touched a bit on the theme that, leaders on both sides were playing to the court of international public opinion and thinking about their place in history and that kind of thing. How did that actually work out for them, would you say? Did these examples of retaliation, this careful correspondence and so on, did that go on to be used in future conflicts around the world, or did it just kind of stay restricted to the American Civil War?
So I think it has a little bit of an effect. It was interesting to me because the London Times reprints in full a lot of the retaliation correspondence that occurs in the Department of the South. So that told me that, the British really were kind of watching these campaigns and kind of seeing how it played out. And so I think we see the impact of that in the fact that the international conventions that occur in the 1880s and the 1890s, European militaries don't respect the American militaries by that point. Still, they don't consider the US with its army that's been re-demobilized in the 1880s to be a significant force. But it's clear, because of the influence of General Orders Number 100 on the conventions at The Hague and the treaties that are signed in Prague, it's clear that this did have an impact on how European nations started to codify their own views of the international laws of war, because General Orders Number 100 does influence that strongly. And so I think between the fact that they're watching these retaliation incidents occur, and then that the war does produce that order, it does impact what they're thinking later. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was really useful. So it seems as though it's one point, it's influenced by the international laws of war that already exist, and then goes on to affect people's thinking about the laws of war after that as well.
Yeah, because for a century after the Civil War, how Lieber defines what a combatant is based on his reading of, that's even today. There's been modifications, but I read some of the literature on the laws of war today when I was researching for this book. And they basically use Lieber's definition from General Orders 100.
Very interesting. Yeah. So I think we're about to wrap things up here. I just have a couple of things to say by way of conclusion. One of them is just to thank everyone in the audience for attending this evening. It's really good of you to bring your questions and your comments and your interest in the topic. We really appreciate that. I also want to thank the donors over the years to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. They make everything we do possible. I really appreciate their support. And I hope I see audience members at future events, whether it's on webinars. I mentioned our next one is on April 26th, or we also have in-person events in Blacksburg. We have our annual Civil War weekend coming up at the end of next week, which I'm very much looking forward to. So I hope I see some of the attendees at future events. And I'd also like to thank our speaker, Dr. Foote, for bringing such a fascinating presentation, giving great great, really thoughtful answers to the questions as well. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's intrigued by your next project. And hopefully once that takes shape, you'll be able to come back and tell us all about that one as well. But for now, thank you very much for being with us this evening. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.